On the afternoon of March 26, 1986, a sound carried across Swindon for the last time. It was not the whistle of a departing train, or the sharp rhythm of a hammer on steel, or the clatter of wheels leaving the sheds. It was the works hooter, the voice of a town that had lived by railway time for more than a century. At 4:30 in the afternoon, it sounded over the old Great Western Railway works, and then it stopped. For generations, that sound had divided the day. It told men when to begin, when to pause, when to return, and when to go home. It reached terraces of railway cottages, public houses, shops, kitchens, schools, and streets where children grew up knowing that the town's heartbeat came from behind the walls of the works. At its height, Swindon Works was one of the great railway engineering complexes of the world. It covered more than 300 acres. It employed thousands upon thousands of people. It could turn drawings into locomotives, raw steel into motion, brass and timber into carriages, and a quiet Wiltshire settlement into one of Britain's most important railway towns. But by 1986, the world that had created it had vanished. Steam had gone. British Rail had changed. The old railway workshops were no longer treated as temples of engineering skill, but as expensive assets in a system being cut, reorganized, and centralized. The town that had once built the machines of empire was told that the empire of the railways no longer needed it. The end did not arrive suddenly. It came in stages, first as modernization, then as rationalization, then as uncertainty, then as silence. Locomotives stopped being built. Workshops closed. Buildings were sold. Skills that had passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, no longer had a guaranteed place in the future. And that is the deeper tragedy of Swindon Works. Factories like this do not disappear only when the gates close. They disappear when the system that gave them meaning is dismantled piece by piece. The buildings may survive, the name may remain. A museum may preserve the tools, the signs, the photographs, and the polished brass. But the living thing, the daily cooperation of thousands of skilled hands, cannot be rebuilt once it is allowed to die. So, how did a railway works that helped build modern Britain become a silent relic in the middle of the town it created? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, before the workshops, before the village, before the hooter, to a railway line that needed a home for its machines. The story begins with the Great Western Railway. In the 1830s, Britain was changing at a speed that previous generations could hardly imagine. Canals, coaching roads, and turnpikes had shaped the old geography of movement. But the railway promised something different. Distance compressed into hours, not days. Goods moved with regularity. Passengers carried across the country by fire, iron, and steam. The Great Western Railway was conceived as a route between London and Bristol, a line that would connect the capital to the west of England and eventually to the Atlantic world beyond. Its chief engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, brought to the project his usual scale of ambition. The railway was not merely to be built. It was to be grand, fast, technically confident, a new kind of machine laid across the landscape. But a railway is never just rails. It needs engines, and those engines need constant attention. Early locomotives were powerful but demanding machines. They wore out parts. They broke springs. They cracked, leaked, overheated, and shook themselves loose. They were not disposable products. They were living mechanisms, and to keep them alive, a railway needed workshops. That responsibility fell heavily on Daniel Gooch, the young locomotive superintendent of the Great Western Railway. Gooch understood something essential. If the GWR was to operate reliably, it could not remain dependent on a scattered collection of outside locomotive makers and temporary repairs. It needed a central place where engines could be maintained, rebuilt, improved, and eventually constructed. Swindon was not an obvious industrial giant waiting to happen. It was a small market town set on a hill, with rural land around it. But it had geography on its side. It lay on the line between London and Bristol, in a position useful for engine working. It was near canal transport and coal supply routes. It offered space. It offered possibility. In 1841, the decision was made. The Great Western Railway would establish its works at Swindon. At first, the works was not meant to be the colossal industrial city it later became. It began as a repair and maintenance facility, Engines came in to be serviced, stripped, restored, and sent out again. The earliest buildings were functional: sheds, shops, offices, yards. There was no romance in the work itself. There was grease, heat, iron filing, smoke, and noise. Yet from that practical beginning, something much larger emerged. The problem of maintenance became the opportunity of manufacture. If the works could repair locomotives, it could improve them. If it could improve them, it could build parts. If it could build parts, it could build whole engines. Swindon's purpose widened from keeping the Great Western running to shaping what the Great Western would become. This was the first great strength of the works. It was not just a factory attached to a railway. It was the railway's mechanical intelligence. Lessons learned from broken engines returned to the drawing office. Problems on the line became changes in design. The people who built, drove, repaired, and inspected locomotives were connected by the same institution. That connection mattered. In a fragmented system, failure disappears into paperwork. At Swindon, failure came back through the gate, blackened with coal smoke, waiting to be understood. A cracked component was not merely replaced. It became evidence. A worn bearing, a damaged wheel, a poor steaming engine, each was a message from the railway itself. This is how Swindon began to rise, not through spectacle, but through disciplined correction. The works existed because the railway needed reliability. It grew because reliability demanded knowledge, and knowledge, once gathered in one place, becomes power. Before the railway, Swindon was not built to absorb thousands of industrial workers. It did not have the housing, the schools, the institutions, or the infrastructure required for a massive workforce. If the Great Western Railway wanted men to work at Swindon, it had to help create the conditions in which those men and their families could live. So the factory did something that great Victorian industrial enterprises often did. It became a town maker. South of the railway line, a railway village began to form. Streets of cottages were built for the workers. They were arranged with a kind of practical order, close enough to the works for men to walk to their shifts, but substantial enough to give the new community a recognizable shape. These were not grand houses. They were homes tied directly to employment, rent, discipline, routine, and belonging. The naming of the streets carried the railway into everyday life. Bath, Bristol, London, Oxford, Reading. The places served by the Great Western became the geography of the village itself. A worker might leave his cottage on a street named after a station, walk under or across the railway, enter the works, and spend the day building the machines that linked all those names together. The separation between work and life was narrow. The works needed skilled labor, and skilled labor needed more than wages. It needed medical care, education, recreation, religion, and social life. So around the factory grew churches, schools, a mechanics institute, medical facilities, baths, reading rooms, and public houses. The factory was not only where men earned money, it was the center of a complete social system. This was not pure benevolence. It was also control. A stable workforce served the company. Housing helped bind workers to the railway. Institutions encouraged discipline, improvement, and loyalty. But it would be too simple to see only paternalism. For the people who lived there, these institutions became real places of community. They gave working families access to things that many industrial towns lacked. The Great Western Railway Medical Fund became one of the most important examples. Built from the needs of workers in dangerous industrial employment, it offered healthcare long before Britain had a national health system. In a place where heavy machinery, hot metal, steam pressure, and manual labor could injure a man in seconds, medical provision was not an abstract ideal. It was a necessity. The Mechanics Institute offered another kind of infrastructure, intellectual and cultural life. It gave workers access to reading, lectures, education, entertainment, and self-improvement. In the 19th century, that mattered. A railway works did not run only on muscle. It depended on calculation, precision, literacy, measurement, and technical understanding. A culture of improvement supported a culture of engineering. By the middle of the century, Swindon was no longer just a place on a railway. It was becoming a railway society. The works brought people from across Britain. It reshaped the population. It created local identity. A child born into the railway village inherited more than an address. He inherited a world of expectations, the sound of the hooter, the presence of the line, the knowledge that somewhere behind the walls his father, uncle, brother, or neighbor worked on machines that traveled far beyond the town. That is why the later closure hurt so deeply. It did not merely remove jobs. It broke the oldest organizing principle of modern Swindon. To imagine Swindon Works only as a locomotive shed is to underestimate it. At full strength, it was a vast industrial organism. It contained erecting shops, boiler shops, machine shops, foundries, pattern shops, fitting shops, carriage works, wagon works, paint shops, timber yards, offices, stores, and sidings. It was a place where almost every discipline of railway engineering could be brought together. A locomotive did not simply appear at the end of a production line. It emerged from a chain of specialized labor. Patterns were made for castings. Metal was poured. Wheels were turned. Boilers were riveted. Frames were machined. Copper, brass, iron, and steel passed through different hands, each trade leaving its mark. A drawing in an office became a template, then a casting, then a component, then part of a machine powerful enough to haul people and goods across the country. The physical atmosphere would have been overwhelming. There was the ring of hammers, the hiss of steam, the smell of oil, coal smoke, hot metal, timber, paint, and leather. There were sparks in the smithy, shavings in the wood shops, rows of tools, chains, cranes, wheels, axles, and half-built engines standing like skeletons beneath the roof. Men worked in heat, noise, and danger, but also in a world of intense skill. The genius of Swindon was integration. A railway company that depended on outside suppliers could buy machines. But a railway company with Swindon Works could develop an engineering culture of its own. It could standardize. It could experiment. It could learn through use. The works allowed the Great Western Railway to express itself mechanically. That expression became visible in the locomotives. The Great Western developed a distinctive identity. Broad-gauge ambition in the early years, later standard-gauge power, polished brass, green livery, carefully proportioned engines, and a reputation for engineering excellence. Swindon was part of that mythology. It was where the company's confidence became material. The works did not only produce locomotives, it produced standards. It produced methods. It produced generations of apprentices trained into a particular way of thinking. The apprentice system was one of its deepest foundations. Young men entered the works and learned not only a trade, but an industrial language. They learned how to read drawings, handle tools, judge materials, respect tolerances, and understand that a small error in a workshop could become a large failure on the line. This was knowledge embedded in hands. In modern business language, it might be called capability. In Swindon, it was simply the way things were done. The works carried memory. It knew how earlier engines had failed. It knew which designs had worked. It knew how to adapt. That continuity made it powerful, but it also made it vulnerable because institutions built around accumulated craft can struggle. When the entire technological system changes, Swindon became great in the age of steam because steam rewarded exactly the kind of knowledge Swindon possessed. Heavy engineering, boilers, wheels, frames, fittings, repair, rebuilding, and constant mechanical refinement. But when Britain's railway future moved away from steam, the foundation beneath Swindon began to shift. At first, that shift looked like modernization. Later, it looked like decline. The story of Swindon Works cannot be told only through locomotives. The factory mattered because it entered ordinary life. It set the rhythm of streets. It shaped family histories. It gave the town a shared language of trades: fitter, turner, boilermaker, pattern maker, painter, carriage trimmer, machinist, clerk, apprentice. A person's place in Swindon could often be understood through the works. Which shop did he work in? Which shift? Which gate did he use? Did his father work there? Did his sons follow? Which pub did workers gather in after hours? Which institute, club, chapel, or union meeting gave shape to their lives beyond the bench? The entrance tunnel itself became symbolic. Thousands of workers passed through it on their way between the railway village and the works. It was a physical threshold between domestic life and industrial labor. On one side were cottages, churches, shops, and schools. On the other side was the vast machine. Every working day the town flowed through that narrow passage. Factories often create this kind of geography. They teach people where to walk, when to wake, where to meet, and how to measure time. They make invisible systems visible. In Swindon, the railway was not distant infrastructure. It was outside the window under the feet and inside the family wage packet. This closeness produced pride. There was pride in belonging to the Great Western, pride in skilled work, pride in seeing engines leave the works, and knowing that they carried Swindon's labour across Britain, pride in the idea that a town once known only modestly had become essential to the railway age. But pride also carried dependency. When one employer dominates a town for generations, it becomes more than an employer. It becomes a guarantee. People build lives around its assumed permanence. Houses are bought, children raised, apprenticeships begun, and retirements imagined on the belief that the institution will continue. Swindon Works seemed permanent because it had survived so much. It survived changes in locomotive design. It survived the end of the broad gauge. It survived wars. It survived nationalisation. It survived the transition from the Great Western Railway to British Railways. It adapted again and again. And because it had adapted before, many believed it could adapt forever. But no factory is permanent simply because it has history. A factory survives when the system around it still needs the work it is built to do. By the late 20th century, that need was weakening. The painful truth was that the very completeness that had once made Swindon strong could be reinterpreted as excess. Large workshops, many trades, inherited buildings, deep traditions, and a workforce trained around railway engineering could be seen either as national assets or as costs. In an age of cuts and reorganization, they were increasingly seen as costs. That shift in perception was fatal. At its peak, Swindon Works represented the confidence of the railway age. By the early 20th century, the works had grown into a vast complex. Thousands of workers moved through its gates. The town around it expanded. The Great Western Railway was no longer an experiment connecting London and Bristol. It was a mature transport system with a powerful identity, and Swindon was its workshop heart. This was the era when railway companies were among the most important industrial organisations in Britain. They owned tracks, stations, hotels, docks, ships, workshops, land, housing, and social institutions. They moved coal, milk, mail, soldiers, holidaymakers, newspapers, livestock, machinery, and food. They controlled time as much as transport. A railway works of Swindon's scale was therefore not merely a place of manufacture, it was strategic infrastructure. Every locomotive repaired there returned value to the network. Every carriage built or maintained affected passenger service. Every wagon mattered to freight. Every skilled worker contributed to the reliability of a system on which the country depended. The works also served as a symbol of British industrial confidence. It demonstrated that the railway was not only an invention, but a civilization of engineering. In Swindon, design, labour, logistics, housing, medicine, education, and town planning were all tied to the same enterprise. Few places showed so clearly how industrial Britain worked when it worked at scale. Yet the seeds of vulnerability were already present. Swindon was deeply attached to one industry, and within that industry, to a particular technological tradition. Steam locomotion was not just one product among many. It was the central object around which the work's identity had formed. Its workshops, tools, skills, and culture had grown in conversation with steam. This did not mean Swindon was primitive. Quite the opposite. Steam locomotive engineering required extraordinary sophistication. A large locomotive was a moving pressure vessel, a thermal machine, a structure under stress, and a transport instrument exposed to weather, speed, load, and constant vibration. To build one required serious expertise, but technological mastery can become a trap when the technology itself loses its future. In the first half of the 20th century, steam still dominated British railway imagination, but the pressure for change was building. Road transport grew. Motor cars and lorries challenged the railway's monopoly. After the Second World War, Britain faced economic strain, aging infrastructure, and a railway system that needed modernization. Nationalization in 1948 brought the railways into a new political and administrative world. The old company identities were absorbed into British railways. Swindon continued to build and repair. It remained important, but its historic role was now being judged inside a larger national system. where decisions would increasingly be made according to modernization plans, budgets, rationalization, and competition between workshops. The Great Western World had created Swindon. British Rail would decide whether it still needed it. In 1960, Swindon Works completed a locomotive that now feels almost too symbolic to be real. It was called Evening Star. The name alone seemed to understand the moment. This was the last steam locomotive built for British Railways. It emerged from Swindon not at the beginning of a new age, but at the edge of an ending. It was painted with care, named with ceremony, and preserved almost from birth by the knowledge that it represented the close of a chapter. For Swindon, Evening Star was both triumph and warning. It proved that the works could still build with excellence. The skills were there, the tools were there, the pride was there. But the future was no longer there in the same way. A final masterpiece is still final. The railway industry was moving toward diesel and electric traction. The modern railway would not be organized around steam sheds, boiler shops, and the old rhythms of locomotive construction. That did not mean Swindon had no possible future. It did work on diesel traction and continued in repair and engineering roles. But the symbolic center had shifted. Once a factory loses the product that defines it, it must either reinvent itself completely or slowly become peripheral. Swindon's decline was not a simple story of incompetence. It was a story of structural change. The railway needed fewer steam skills. The old regional loyalties mattered less. Workshop capacity across the country was reviewed, compared, consolidated, and reduced. Other works competed for maintenance and repair roles. British rail engineering became part of a changing industrial landscape. The beaching era, with its cuts to lines and services, also changed the scale of the railway system. A smaller network required fewer vehicles, fewer repairs, fewer facilities. When the system contracts, its workshops feel the pressure. The loss of railway work does not remain abstract. It becomes empty benches, closed shops, and men wondering which department will be next. For a time, Swindon found new roles. There were periods of revival, repair work, and adaptation. But the long direction was clear. The works was no longer the indispensable heart of a proud private railway company. It was one site among several inside a national industry under pressure, and when a site becomes one option among several, history alone cannot save it. The tragedy is that Swindon still had skill. What it lacked was a protected strategic role. The national railway system no longer organized itself around preserving the full industrial ecology that had created places like Swindon. Skills were admired, remembered, even celebrated. But admiration is not the same as investment. The works that had once built the future now found itself preserving the past. Industrial decline rarely begins with a locked gate. It begins with changes in language. A workshop becomes a cost center. A craft becomes an inefficiency. A workforce becomes a headcount. A historic site becomes land value. Decisions that once might have been made in the name of capability are made in the name of rationalization. Swindon Works lived through exactly that kind of transition. By the 1980s, Britain's railway workshops were operating in an atmosphere of uncertainty. Work was being redistributed. Locomotive building had been outsourced or centralized elsewhere. Maintenance was reorganized. The great inherited works of the railway age were no longer all guaranteed a place. In such a climate, Swindon's strengths could be used against it. It was large. It was old. It sat on valuable land near the town centre. It carried buildings from different phases of industrial history, many designed for earlier forms of production. It had heritage value, but heritage value does not automatically keep men employed. The closure was presented as part of wider industrial logic. The railway industry was changing. Workshops had to be reduced. Maintenance and repair could be handled differently. The old structure no longer fit the new system. But for workers and residents, this logic could not erase what was being lost. A factory like Swindon was not replaceable by any single new employer. Its value lay in the density of skill, memory, and identity accumulated over 143 years. It had trained generations. It had supported families. It had given Swindon a civic story. To close it was to remove one of the town's deepest roots. People fought the closure. They marched, campaigned, argued, and tried to defend the works. Their resistance mattered because it showed that the factory still had social meaning. It was not an obsolete shed in the eyes of those who lived with it. It was part of who they were, but protest could not overcome the forces aligned against the works. By then, the old railway town had already been changing. New industries had arrived. Swindon was no longer solely dependent on the works in the way it had once been. That helped the town survive, but it also weakened the argument that the works had to be saved at any cost. The factory's historic dominance had faded enough for closure to become politically possible. This is one of the cruel patterns of industrial decline. A town diversifies because it must. Then that diversification is used as evidence that the old industry can disappear. The community is told it will adapt. Sometimes it does. But adaptation does not mean nothing was lost. Swindon adapted. The works did not survive. The final years carried a strange mixture of activity and mourning. There was still work to be done. Men still entered the site. Tools were still used. Buildings still stood. But the future had been withdrawn. Once closure becomes certain, a factory changes even before it shuts. Every ordinary task becomes part of a countdown. Every familiar sound begins to feel temporary. The campaign against closure showed how deeply the works remained embedded in local consciousness. Employees and residents understood that they were defending more than jobs. They were defending the continuity of a town story that stretched back to Brunel Gooch, the railway village, the medical fund, the Mechanics' Institute, the great locomotive classes, and the generations who had passed through the gates. But the decision held. On March 26, 1986, Swindon Works closed. The hooter sounded for the last time. The end of railway engineering in the town was not just a local event. It was a marker in the long retreat of Britain's old industrial railway culture. The closure also left behind a question: what do you do with a place too historically important to forget, but too industrially obsolete to continue? The answer was redevelopment. The walls that had hidden much of the works from ordinary Swindonians came down in meaning, if not all at once in brick. Parts of the site were sold. Some buildings were demolished. Others survived because of their architectural and historic importance. The old industrial landscape was open to new uses: offices, retail, museums, public space, and heritage interpretation. This afterlife is complicated. On one hand, preservation saved important buildings. The Steam Museum now occupies part of the former works and tells the story of the Great Western Railway and the men and women connected to it. Historic offices found new life. The railway village remains visible. The tunnel, cottages, institutions, and surviving industrial structures allow people to read the town's history in stone and brick. On the other hand, preservation can never fully replace production. A museum can display a tool, but it cannot recreate the daily world that gave the tool its purpose. A converted building can protect architecture, but not the noise of the shop floor. A plaque can name the past, but it cannot reproduce the confidence of a town that knew exactly what it made. That is why Swindon Works remains emotionally powerful. It survives as memory and architecture, but not as labor. The machines are gone. The workforce dispersed. The skills were carried into retirement, other industries, or family stories. What remains is a landscape haunted by usefulness. Today, Swindon still carries the imprint of the works. You can see it in the railway village, in the surviving buildings, in the museum, in the old routes workers took, in the names of streets and public houses, in the way the town's identity continues to circle back to the railway. The works closed, but it did not vanish completely. This is important, because industrial history is often told as if closure is the final page. In reality, closure begins another story: the struggle over memory. What should be remembered? The engineering achievements, the locomotives, the architecture, the hardship, the community, the pride, the anger, the political decisions, the men who built machines, the families who lived by the hooter, the institutions that grew around work. Swindon asks us to remember all of it. It asks us to see that a factory can be a productive machine and a social machine at the same time. Swindon Works manufactured locomotives, carriages, and railway equipment, but it also manufactured habits, identities, institutions, and civic confidence. It turned a small town into a railway town. It made employment into belonging. Its decline was not caused by one simple villain. It was caused by technological transition, railway restructuring, competition between workshops, changing transport economics, government policy, land pressures, and a national loss of faith in older industrial systems. The works was not destroyed in one blow. It was made unnecessary by a world that had once depended on it, then reorganized itself around different priorities. That is why the story still matters. Across Britain, many towns carry similar wounds. Shipyards, steelworks, collieries, car plants, textile mills, railway workshops, places that once seemed permanent were closed, sold, demolished, or transformed. Some towns recovered economically, some did not. But even where jobs returned, the older meaning often did not. A logistics park can employ. A retail center can attract visitors. Offices can fill space. But the relationship between a town and a great works is different. It is deeper, slower, more intergenerational. It creates a shared sense of purpose that is difficult to replace. Swindon Works reminds us that industrial decline is not only about economics. It is about memory, dignity, and the loss of systems that allowed skill to accumulate over time. When the last hooter sounded in 1986, it marked the end of 143 years of railway engineering in Swindon. But it also marked the end of a particular idea of Britain, a country that built vast machines in vast workshops, trained generations in practical skill, and organized entire towns around the belief that engineering mattered. The works is no longer alive in the way it was, but in the surviving stone, in the tunnel beneath the railway, in the cottages of the railway village, in the museum displays, in the stories of former workers, and in the memory of that final blast. Something remains, not the factory itself, the proof that it once mattered. If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries about the factories, industries, and forgotten companies that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support would be much appreciated.